If you went to school of a certain period of time, like I did, you know what a school lunch tray looks like. It is plastic and it has lots of little squares and places for your food. There's the one I had, and this is probably the same one that you had, there's like a kind of a long slot for your utensils to go in on one side, and then there's a little square for your square milk carton. There's a big rectangle for the main course, or those rectangular pieces of pizza, which are unique to school lunches, and which, by the way, I've learned still happen. We get rectangular square pizzas on occasion in the school lunches. There's a little spot for dessert. There's a couple of places for sides, vegetables and stuff. And I remember as a kid how delightful that was, because none of your food got mixed together. You'd walk through the line and the lunch ladies would put the proper portion and eat in its proper place, and then they'd hand it to you and you'd cart it off to your table and sit down with your friends, and the slimy green beans didn't have to touch the pizza. Actually, on pizza days, in my school, we always had corn. I don't know why that seems to be universal, but corn and pizza go together in lunch lady minds, apparently. And that was great. I remember as a kid, if something did spill over the side, I felt a sort of mild compulsion to put it back in its proper little square and keep everything nice and neat. And it helped when we had sloppy food, like Sloppy Joe's. Or in Texas, because I grew up in Texas, we would occasionally for lunch have tamales. And in Texas, when you have tamales, you don't just have the tamales, you always put like this sort of beef gravy chili thing on top. It's delicious. I don't know why we do it that way, but that's the Tex-Mex way of doing it. And that kept your, gravy from getting into the other food. It's a perfect way to keep things neat and tidy and in their proper place. And that's fine for school lunches. But it's also how we are often taught to think of our lives. Compartmentalized and everything neat and tidy and in its proper place, and not really interacting much at all. I don't even remember which friend this was in elementary school, but I had a friend, I looked over and we were all horrified because they had taken some of the veggie from this portion and put it with the veggies from this portion and mixed them together. What are you doing? He's like, I like it this way. Oh, that's not how it's supposed to be. And we see in our lives when people start mixing stuff, how is that supposed to be that way? We get anxious when our lives begin to mix and mingle sometimes. How often have you heard the phrase work-life balance, or used the phrase, it's important to have work-life balance? And it is important to have work-life balance. But isn't it strange? Isn't it strange that we somehow separate work from life, as though we're not living when we're working? As though the choice of how we spend 8 or 10 hours a day sometimes is distinct from our life. What we're really talking about when we say work-life balance is life balance. How much of it are we going to invest in our work as opposed to our family and our community and our own personal restoration and well-being? But when your life is separated that way, when it's partitioned, one part from another, you begin to think of it in terms of this part and this part separately, not the impact they have on each other. Some Pharisees wanted to test Jesus, so they came and they said, look, here's the thing. Is it lawful to pay taxes or not? They thought this was a great trap, because they knew that for faithful Jewish folks of Jesus' day, it was onerous to pay taxes because you were supporting the government that was oppressing you, and they considered it unclean and sort of wrong to have the emperor's head on the coin. It reminded them of their subjugation, it reminded them that they had a financial stake in their own oppression. They thought it was an affront to God. So if Jesus said, you should pay taxes, then he would risk offending some of his followers, perhaps. But if he said, no, you shouldn't pay taxes, well, then they've got him on tax evasion. And that used to be a hard way to stay in the political life. It seems not to be so much of a problem anymore, but they thought they had him trapped because there was no way to do both of those things. Those two shouldn't mingle. But of course, Jesus sees the trap coming. He asks the Pharisees a question, whose head is on this thing? They say, well, Caesar's. He said, well, give it back to him. And give to God the things that are God's. And that question, that statement at the end of his response, to render to God the things that are God's, that's the heartbeat of this moment in this exchange. Because it raises a question, doesn't it? What belongs to God then? If the coin belongs to Caesar because it has his image on it, what belongs to God? The very first thing that the Bible tells us about humanity is that we are made in the image of God. We belong to God because God's image is within us. And if we belong to God, then the things that we do, the way that we live, the choices that we make belong to God. And we cannot really neatly compartmentalize this part of our life from another. A school lunch tray life says, I've got this many hours, 40 hours a week for work. And every day I've got 2 hours for my family. And an hour of time for myself watching TV. I know this is just totally made up numbers, right? But I have 12 hours every weekend to go and play. I have this many hours that I can commit to volunteering. And we imagine that those things are all distinct and separate. Spots on the tray to be filled up. And the problem with that is that we begin to think not just in terms of numbers of hours, but in terms of ways of seeing and acting that are divided from one another. We no longer think of our faith as informing our whole lives. We think of our faith as the thing that we go and participate in a few hours a week at church. I was part of a church staff once that had bought a plot of property and were expanding, and there was a house next door that had been there for a long time, about the same time the church was built. And the house was for sale. And it was in the way that the area had grown up, it really wasn't a great house location anymore. And so the church talked to the neighbor who was selling the house and said, hey, would be interested in buying this if you're interested in selling. And he said, well, of course, I'd be happy to sell it to you. And they sat down and entered into negotiation. And the church said, well, we think that this would be a fair price. And the price that the real estate agent said was fair was not what the seller thought was fair. He was asking for a lot more than the house was probably really worth. And so they had a conversation back and forth, and at some point the man who was selling the house said, well, I like the church and I like you, preacher, but business is business. And he thought that because he was selling to a church, he should ask for and get more money. Now, he wasn't a part of that congregation. I don't know if he was a part of any congregation. But that idea that he so clearly articulated is one that a lot of us hold, even if we don't say it out loud as much. That church is church and business is business. Church is church and my vote is my vote. Church is church and my ideas about taxation are entirely separate. But it's not how God invites us to live. We belong entirely to God. And the decisions that we make, the way we use our money, the way we use our time, the way we use our energy, all of it belongs to God. All of it belongs to God because we are made in the image of God. How we choose to vote reflects what we believe. How we choose to spend our money says something about what we truly think of following Jesus. And it doesn't mean that there's only one answer that Christians can come to, but it does mean that we don't get to separate out and say, well, I like what Jesus said about this part, but not when he talked about feeding the hungry. I like Jesus for saving me, but I don't like Jesus telling me that I should give up my wealth. You see, that's not how it works. We don't get to compartmentalize the work of the Spirit. We don't get to compartmentalize the gospel in our lives. We all entirely belong to God. Every last little bit of us. So as we enter into this fall season, brothers and sisters, as you hold that ballot in hand, as we look towards the coming year of life and ministry in the church, as we look at our community struggling to get by, remember that we belong to God. Every bit of us, every ounce of energy, every last penny, every act of love. We belong to God. So let us give to God that which is God's. Let us commit our whole lives for the work of God's kingdom. Let us render ourselves to the one who makes us. And that, my friends, is the good news this day. Thanks be to God. Amen.